Everyone, welcome to the Nordic HLPF side event on youth, climate action and democracy. And I'm really happy to see so many people here, even though it's quite late in the afternoon. And I'm sure we have even more people online following, as this will be live streamed. This event is hosted by the government of Iceland, who currently have the chairmanship of the Nordic Council of Ministers, in collaboration with the Secretary General Envoy on Youth, so that office, and also with the Nordic Council of Ministers. And my name is Nora Lövström, and I'm a youth representative in the expert group on sustainable development of the Nordic Council of Ministers. So there's youth representation in this group as well. And as said, the event is live streamed, and we use two hashtags. So Generation 2030, which is a program of the Nordic Council of Ministers, and SDG 13. And of course, you can also use the HLPF 2019 should you want. And we'll also have room for questions at the end. So if you have some insight or some things that you want to ask, there will be an opportunity at a later stage.
Okay, my name is Jimisa. I'm from Botswana, and I'm a Civicus Goalkeeper Accelerator. I think one thing that I've learned is that you find that a lot of the same actors that compromise reproductive rights, multilateralism, gender issues, are really the same actors who actually try to erase issues of climate change. And one thing that I've learned is that there's always a gap in terms of accountability and in ensuring that there's advancements, or actually there are forms of civic participation in governance mechanisms. And I think particularly when you're talking about youth participation, you don't find a lot of young people being included in treaty body work or even in human rights work. And I think that's an easy low-hanging fruit, particularly because you're finding such advanced committees, such as the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, that actually ask these questions from an intersectionality basis. And I mean, you're talking about issues of indigenous rights, you're talking about issues of grey imports in trade. And these are things that I think that young people need to actually start claiming that space, particularly because it's an occupied, shrinking civil space. So I think, you know, there's a need for us to actually try and create some of the synergies that aren't really common in terms of linking to, is it business and human rights, or CIDA, or even mechanisms such as the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So that's just my comment.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing in gender also in this and these indigenous people's rights and so on, because we want to look at the whole agenda as well and not just on climate change, because everything is interlinked. One
more optimistic. I just would like to say, considering your question, I think, or remark really, because I think it's an important remark, because climate change is not something that you can talk about in isolation. It's closely connected to gender equality, to all sorts of political trends that we are seeing concerning LGBTI rights, women's rights, etc. So we're seeing trends, regressive trends, and I think we should be very much aware of that context. And I think when we talk about climate change, it's not just about intergenerational justice, it's also about inequalities in the world today, economic inequalities and inequalities between different groups. So I think we have to always bear that in mind. Talking about climate change, we have to talk about social justice at the same time. And because I am very passionate about gender equality, I think we must bear in mind that climate change has a very different effect on men and women. We are seeing very different consequences for men and women, but also different actors when it comes to causing climate change. So more gender equality is one of the keys to a more successful fight against climate change. But because I know we are finishing, I would just use this moment to say thank you. And I think even though we are a little bit pessimistic, I feel very inspirational after listening to all that young people here in the room. So thank you so much for giving us that inspiration. Thank you.
We will do that. I think for me, the gist of the conversation and the arguments around the inclusion of young people, how do we include the more marginalized communities, is really understanding that climate action cannot come at the cost of social exclusion. It cannot be that a group of elite elites save the world on behalf of the most poorest, marginalized, vulnerable people who are affected by the crisis. I think it's not just about climate action. That is why it's so important that it is also about climate justice. So there are communities who are affected by the climate change, adverse effects of climate change, who had very little to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, who had very little to contribute to global warming. The indigenous communities in Latin America, the communities living in the small island developing states, the young people living in the coastlines of Kiribati had very little to do to the contribution of global greenhouse gas emissions, but they're living the repercussions and the consequences. So we have to make sure in our conversations about climate action, in our conversations about climate justice, we include those who are most marginalized and those who are most affected by this crisis as well. Not just because we are doing them a favor, because they have a right to participate in making these decisions that affect their lived realities. And on the other side, these communities actually have the solutions to these issues as well. The indigenous communities for hundreds of thousands of years have had practices that safeguard their territories, the communities that they live in. The fishing communities in the Maldives, for an example, have practiced, for an example, sustainable fishing methods for thousands of years. So these communities actually have grassroots, homegrown solutions that we need to be incorporating when we talk about our massive plans, when it comes to 2030 or 2050, when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. And the other part, and I'm very glad that it came across in the conversation, is the intersectionality of the climate action. I'm sometimes worried that I have young people tell me that, oh, we can deal with the gender equality later, we can deal with this problem later. Climate change is the biggest crisis, we need to solve it now. But I think we need to be better at communicating how these issues are interlinked with each other. How, for an example, in my home country, Sri Lanka, which was the second most affected country by the climate crisis last year, according to the UNFCCC, every day if you watch news, you see farmers taking their own lives and committing suicide because they cannot produce the amount of yield they could produce some years before, because the rain patterns have changed, because the floods are unexpected. There's flash floods every time. I've spoken to girls from the northern Nigeria, for an example, who are experiencing increased gender-based violence in their homes, in their communities, because there's lack of food, lack of water in the household, and unfortunately women are being punished because they are not able to, say, put food on the table. Or usually young women and girls in the families do not get to eat at all because they don't have enough food to feed the entire family. Conflicts, for an example, in the Lake Chad Basin, there are conflicts among the communities who live in the basin because of the drought that climate change and climate impacts have caused. Migration, the climate-induced migration and climate refugees, a term that we are very scared to use here in the UN. For an example, in Bangladesh, in the coming years, millions of people are going to be displaced and become refugees because of climate change. And the number of people who are losing their jobs because of the rising sea levels, and as the Prime Minister mentions, the agriculture field, the fisheries field. And I think that's very, very important. We draw these intersectionalities and bring to the conversation that climate action is not just about Goal 13, or just focusing on A, B, C actions to solve the climate action, but also seeing how it impacts the lives of other people, for an example, the broader set of sustainable development goals as well. And then maybe closing and wrapping up, I was very interested by your question on democracy and sort of have our democracies failed us. Is that why we are seeing more young people coming out and protesting? And I think there is a trend, and we see increasingly that young people are losing trust in political institutions. Either it is in the Nordic countries, in the global north or the global south, there is an increasing trend that young people do not believe that their political leaders represent the most emerging or the most important issues in their community. So we need to be better at having social dialogue, having more educational and awareness programs to also educate the polity about these issues. And I want to end and notice that, for an example, in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe, we have seen the increased amount of social dialogue between policymakers, especially young people, through the Greta Thunberg-inspired movement. And this social dialogue and debate actually was reflected, I think personally, also in the last European Parliament elections, where 47% of the Green Party seats, the number of seats that they got was increased by 47%. And I think that's why we need to be having these conversations, and we need to be educating also, not just young people, but our polity in general, so that they can also make better decisions as voters as to who they elect and how they engage in politics in their day-to-day lives. And also very important that we look at not just national parliaments and global level, but also looking at municipalities, how our mayors, how our governors also implement the elements related to the Paris Agreement at a very local level, engaging with local communities as well. So that will be my 2 cents for the conclusion.
That was more than 2 cents. I would like to thank our whole panel. I think it's been an excellent discussion. I wish we could continue the conversation. But now our time is up for today. But as a conclusion, yeah, we should break silos. We should engage discussions on all levels and continue involving young people in climate action. Thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to our great panel.